heard great things about you as well. Oh, okay, come on here. Let's get this going. All right, well, it is wonderful to be with you all. And you know, I've been speaking for years, so you don't start with a disclaimer. So I'm not going to call this a disclaimer. I'm going to call this an explanation. This is not going to be a formal presentation. It's going to be somewhat random in terms of the facts and the things that I'm going to share with you, but I didn't do slides or whatever. But this random thing can certainly be emailed to you if you would like to get it, Pastor Annie, after it's over. But I'm so excited about you all. You know, where do we know each other? I'm seeing your face and I'm thinking, yes, you look so familiar to me.
AMS.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I thought I know this gentleman now. It's going through my thoughts.
We've
Okay.
been talking.
Okay. Thanks so much. Well, I take such, not pride as in, you know, bad pride, but I'm so honored to be serving as the social action chairman for United Methodist Women. And so proud of this church for doing these social action lunch and learns. I think it's so important. And I like to say, we don't do social action because we're doing good. We do social action because we're doing God. Because the very character of God is social action, is what do you require of us but to live humbly and do justly and walk with God. So that tickles me beyond words that you are focusing on that in your seminars. That's really great. Today I am going to talk to you about, and it has several names, the school to prison pipeline. This is even more heartbreaking, the cradle to prison pipeline, because now we see even children in preschool are getting caught up in this slippery slope. It is also called the schoolhouse to the jailhouse pipeline. So if you go to research it, there's a lot of different names that it goes by. All I think are equally heartbreaking. But what this is it's a process where young people are funneled from education into the criminal justice system by a variety of different means, and we'll be talking about that. But you know what? If you put lipstick on a pig, what do you have? You still have a pig. Right. So we can come up with a lot of names, but let's just cut to the chase. This is another form of systemic racism. I mean, let's just say, call it what it is. This is another thing that our implicit bias and that our stereotypical thinking and all of these kinds of things create, and it just so happens that it affects young people in a terrible way. And there's a lot of things associated with this. Now, because I did serve in the legislature, that makes me what? A very terrible word, a politician. I mean, I'm really not. I've been out of that for a long time. But because I'm a politician, that means I had to be in a party. And so I'm trying very hard not to make this a partisan issue. It really isn't. So if you catch me saying something that could be partisan, raise your hand and say, you said you weren't going to do that. So I'm gonna try really hard not to do that. But anyway, it's a lot of things. It's zero tolerance in our schools for discipline. And of course, I think you can remember back under Reagan when we had the war on drugs, and we became so concerned about locking up people that had anything to do with drugs. And so now I see that we are locking up people that we're really mad at instead of people that we're scared of. And that's how a lot of these things happen as young people in school encounter resource officers. And these are policemen that are actually assigned to the schools. And initially it was for violence and the things you would think of. But now it's become, and I know public education is very complicated, and I am the biggest teacher supporter in the entire world. Next to mothers, there's teachers. So I understand how hey, come in ladies, how difficult it is to be in that classroom. But now we often have resource officers doing jobs that teachers typically used to do when it comes to handling discipline and that sort of a thing. So what we see quite often is that these young people have their first encounter with criminal justice in the schools. and then they get suspended, and then they get behind, and then, you know, it just becomes kind of a slippery slope. So that kind of frames, I think, what we're, you know, talking about. And I acknowledged you all, but my good friend Carolyn Schumacher, who I just think is the best example of United Methodist women that I know, I just adore her, just came in, so it's good to be in a place where she is as well. But you know what, I didn't really become as focused on school to prison pipeline as a legislator until I got involved in United Methodist Women. And for United Methodist Women, and this is our big name right here, we call this criminalization of communities of color, and then the next big umbrella is mass incarceration, and I know you've heard a lot about that. And then we have kind of highlighted the school to prison pipeline, but the quadrennium beginning in 2016 to 2020, which of course you know was so interrupted by COVID, this was one of our 4 priority areas. And now for 2020 to come in to 2024, it's one of 2 priority areas. So this has been a very, very important priority for United Methodist Women. And this is our little tablet, but this kind of sums it up. There's been a 500% increase in incarceration in the last 40 years. And guess what? Arkansas is number 5 in the nation for incarceration. And our prisons are so crowded. And when I was in the legislature and I'd go to those budget hearings and the Department of Corrections would get up there and whine about needing more money, I said to the director one time, I said, you know what? I honestly don't think the Department of Correction can afford for us to stamp out crime. It generates a lot of money. And of course, you all know about the prison complex and the money that generates. And of course, if you want to have a lucrative stock and you don't want to do Bitcoins or GameStop, well, go buy some prison stock. Because I mean, it makes a lot of money. So that says a whole lot about our society. But the incarceration rate, African Americans, children of color, are 3 times more likely, the boys, to be suspended than white boys. It's just a fact. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. 31% of children and youth experience school-based arrest and have law enforcement referrals are African American, though they make up only 15% of total school enrollment. So very, very, very skewed. And of course, Native Americans and others kind of fall into that. And before I go along too far, let me just stop and give a commercial for United Methodist Women. They don't pay me to say this stuff. They just really, really believe it. You know, you don't know this, but I was Southern Baptist for 58 years. And I will be 73 in a couple of weeks. So, you know, you can do the math. But I cannot tell you the pride I feel of being United Methodist and the things we stand for and do, Lynn. You know, I sat there for 3 days on my stool and watched the United Methodist, the Arkansas Conference, because I was an at-large, you know, I am large, but I was voted on by our district to vote, you know, and I sat there the whole time. Of course, our bishop starts off, you know, talking about how the splits and the trouble and all that. You know, by the end of that conference, I wanted to call him up because there's a lot of things I would like to say to him, but this is one of them. We deal with disabilities. We deal with people of color. We deal with disaster relief. We deal with bringing people to Christ. I cannot imagine another small state that has an organization that does more to put the footprint of Jesus Christ in their state than the United Methodist. I really can't. And so the thought of splitting after me finding this is my home, I didn't marry Methodist. I didn't have to be a Methodist. I chose. I had a whole list to pick from when we moved up here. Oh, the thought of a split just makes me inconsolable. It's such a great thing. So this summer with Mission U, one of the books that I'll be teaching is called Push Out. And it is the criminalization of black girls in school. And it is a tearjerker. It's heartbreaking to think about these poor young black girls who, because of being black, many times they're looked at as being hypersexual, or they're looked at as being, I love this back here, all this, they are subjectively punished for being too loud or for having an attitude, all these kind of things, how tragic that is. And so we're going to be looking at that and this concept that's fairly new called intersectionality, and how all these other issues come into play, plus you're black, that make your life so dismal. And that happens a lot in school, not just for black girls, but for black boys as well. And I know, living in Pine Bluff for 30 years, I've spent a lot of time on the campus teaching classes. You know what? Those black girls' voices are shrill. They are loud. They do dress different. And oh my goodness, that hair, and you have to, and of course, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. You have to really say to yourself, no, you cannot look at them differently. That's their culture. That's how they're raised to be. I can remember graduation. No one, and I know you'll join me on this, no one could have been happier to see two kids walk across the stage than we were our two. I'm like, oh, thank you, Jesus. So anyway, but anyway, when they walk across the stage and they call their name, we go. Now over here, if they had said Shantae Jones, woo! Everybody yells and jumps and does flips and runs around and first time ever, and you're thinking, oh, goodness. Well, you know what? That is not wrong. That's just different. That's just how they celebrated. I really wanted to do that. I just didn't have the nerve. I was afraid they'd go, because the teachers were just as glad to get the Gullett boys out of there, No, so you see what I'm saying? All these biases and these stereotypical ideas, that's what's going on in so much of this. And the problem is it's ruining people's lives. It's sending them into a place where their life is basically over as far as being a productive citizen. So we've just got to look at it, from that standpoint. If you're interested, we did a 3-person, Pastor Annie loved this, I called them Zoominars. I put together 3 Zoominars about interrupting the school to prison pipeline, and they're on the arumc.org website. And we had some awesome speakers. And by the way, I've got to give another thumbs up to the Arkansas Conference. Have you looked at the dismantling racism portion of our website? It's awesome. There are courses you can take. There are just everything. So I'm really proud of the Arkansas Conference for hitting this head on. Because could I get an amen that the church has been complicit in these issues? Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was a Baptist, we had to apologize publicly. It was really bad. So these are just some things for your edification. But I've already said the population of mass incarceration has just gone out of sight. There are 16% African Americans in the state of Arkansas, and they comprise 43.5% of the prison population. That's pretty skewed, isn't it? 60% of the youth that are incarcerated are children of color. Now, I want to be clear, we are concerned about Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian kids that go to prison, but for our purposes, we focus on black children and children of color because it's so much more prevalent than you would find in other places. Between 2000 and 2017, the Arkansas prison saw an 84% increase in the women that went to prison. And I can testify that when I was an Arkansas senator and spoke for graduation at Cummins, all these young people got their GED. And nothing has gripped my heart like looking out there and seeing a sea of young people in white uniforms with faded black numbers on them. You know, it was heartbreaking to see that. And I said to him, and I didn't care, what could they do to me? I said, one thing I'm really glad about you learning to read is now you can read the Bible. And now you can find out that God loves you and knows who you are and knows where you are. And as a mother, I can assure you that when she brought you home from the hospital, she never saw you here in her mind, no matter what kind of mother she was. I know she didn't. And so you can find out now that you are really worth a lot. But I was escorted out by this young black woman who had left her children at home. She was serving a 50-year sentence for a first-time drug charge. No, you know, that just shouldn't be. So it's really a lot going on out there. And so we not only have these racial disparities, but are you aware that a lot of the kids that go down this path are special needs children? Large number. Hey, our youngest, 2 learning disabilities and a form of dyslexia. I mean, you know, I was at the school so much when they would look out and see my diesel wagon, the principal would go. Well, we invited him and his wife over for Christmas so they could see that we were Christians. Because I think he thought that we must be demon. No, it was terrible. And we know how easily Ryan, with an anger management problem and self-esteem lower than the ovaries on a chicken, you know, and that's pretty low, he was headed for trouble. So were we. But, you know, we could get help. Yes. So if Ryan hadn't had 2 parents and a dad that's out of this world that taught him how to kick and be, you know, and have a skill that he could walk on the Razorbacks one day, he would have been one of these people. He would have been, because that's just what happens. And so many times these poor children, their parents have the same issues. So they can't help them to overcome some of these things. So African American, special needs, and then let's add in the LGBTQ community. You know, when many of these children come out, they get kicked out of their house. They become homeless. And so you know what? If you're that young and you're homeless, you don't have a whole lot of choices about what you're going to be doing. So it's just a dreadful situation when you look at this population overall about how this is happening. Now, I want to just address this. I think I got off track, imagine that, talking about the school resource officers. I am not on the defund the police bandwagon, not even remotely. Oh, Lord, no. And that being said, I will say that unless resource officers can have unique training, somewhat add a little of the social work and parenting kind of, you know, understanding, it's pretty dangerous for them to have a big presence in discipline on a school campus. It really is. Now, we've known some that we communicate with this day. Officer, what was his name? Officer Davies. I mean, he's the king of all the earth. You know, every kid loved him, every parent did. But if we could take him and clone him and just, you know, put him out there, but it can be a problem. It can be a problem, and that's one of the things that's happening. So these kids get in trouble, and what's the first thing they usually get? Suspended, right? Mm-hmm. Well, so when you're suspended, what happens to your homework and all that sort of thing? You start getting behind. Well, guess what? You start getting very far behind, and what's the obvious thing to that? You're either going to drop out or you're going to get kicked out, you know, one of the two. And there's not a whole lot of options for self-sufficiency when that happens to you. So you're starting to see. Well, I want to, with not trying to pick on the Little Rock School District. Of course, I'm in North Little Rock, so we can pick on them, right? I was telling Bob driving over, you know, Pine Bluff and Whitehall. Little Rock and North Little Rock. Little Rock and Springdale. Oh, I just love it when the big city decides to, you know, pick on the little city. But let's pick on Little Rock, because this is documented. And this was one of the guys, Carolyn, that spoke at our seminar, Chris Burks. Chris Burks, do you all know, any of you know him? My heart throbbed. He was brave enough to sue the Little Rock School District on behalf of the school to prison pipeline, and he won. He won, and now they have to make some very fundamental changes in the way they do business as a result of that. But these are some of the statistics that Chris gave us whenever he spoke at our our Zoominar. In the 18 to 19 school year, 2018-20, there were 254 out-of-school suspensions at McClellan High School. 254. Kids, they're just, out. And so he said, as was expected, the value-added growth, and these are some of the metrics that the department uses to keep up with all that. Their score was about 77.58, which was 10 to 12 points below, what the average was in the state. So it was dramatic. And he said there were 26 out-of-school suspensions for every 100 African-American children at McClellan. Mm-hmm. Now that's nearly a quarter. That is just a staggering number. And he said, as is expected, there are so many arrests and suspensions. The 4-year graduation rate at this time at Little Rock McClellan was 73%, and it was well below the state average of 89.2. And we're going to see a lot of that, I think, now as Arkansas has such a connectivity problem with COVID and with all of these children that were home without connectivity and their poor teachers, trying to teach them remotely or whatever. We're going to have a lot of catching up to do because that's a dreadful, situation. But this one was caused because specifically of what, we're talking about here. And of course, the correlation of suspended and arrest is so high. It just is. And so these were some statistics in January of 2019 given by the Chief Deputy Pulaski County Attorney. 80% of those detained, meaning in a jail or a facility, 80% of those were African American. 80%. 38% of all arrests that were school-based were African American. 98% of those who could have been let out sooner or who were eligible for release were still held. They could have been let out, but they were held. And then, of course, this is dramatic, I think, and lamentable. A lot of these kids could have been released, but to what? Mm-hmm. They had nowhere to be released to, no intact family that could take them or, do something about that. So, it's just like somebody said, it's like skydiving without a parachute. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do? So, put another way, Chris said, in the Little Rock School District over a period of 3 years, for school infractions, African Americans were 500% more likely to get some sort of consequence compared to their white counterparts. Wow. And I didn't really doubt this, but for one of our seminars, we had Dr. Frank Anthony come and talk, who had been the superintendent of Pine Bluff Schools. Bob was on the board, just a great man. And Frank is just a product of his time. He would say, Brenda. I mean, he talked like he was raised to talk. Greatest guy in the world, loved kids, whatever. And I said, Frank, and I did an interview with him, and he's been retired now about 10 years, and they brought him back to get the dollar-way school system out of the soup, because he was kind of a fireman, if you might say. And I said, Frank, do you think it's really true that African-American children get in trouble in school more than white children and for the same thing? He said, oh, absolutely. Now, that was not a prejudiced remark coming from him. In fact, I think he was shocked that I was, but he's known me, he wasn't too shocked, that I was, so much on the side that you would have expected, him to be on. But yeah, I mean, it's just documented. And I'll tell you another thing that I don't think we think about. Do you know that an African-American, now this is a statistic, an African-American child that has just one African-American teacher during their primary school year is 300% more likely to go to college. Mm-hmm. They see that one person that's African-American that's a role model that probably understands them, understands their culture, whatever. It makes a dramatic impact on that child. So we're really we're really lacking in a lot of African American role model teachers. And this other woman that spoke, that you all would have just fallen in love with her, Tina Fletcher, she and her sister are twins from Camden, African American, both are doctoral candidates right now. They have studied all these things with the lens, and her slides are all on the website. The black teachers have such a difficult time passing the praxis test. How many in here of you have ever taken the praxis? Oh my Lord, was it hard?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I've known my son's girlfriend, whoo, I was just starting to pray, Lord, do you really think Mathis is important? Yeah. I mean, she took it about 3 or 4 times, and I know as I was on the state board, we were constantly whacking at those cut scores because special education even, areas of dramatic teacher shortage, we couldn't get people past that praxis. And so we have some work to do there that would make an obvious difference in what's going on. These are just some things I want to highlight because I think it's so interesting. Not particularly about the pipeline, but about systemic racism, which it's a part of. And I'm going to read these because I don't want to mess them up. Black men raised in the top 1% by millionaires were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning $36,000, which, as you know, is just right around the poverty threshold. Now, what does that tell you? Yeah. And then black men earned significantly less than white men, even when they were raised in families making the same amount. Poor black boys tend to stay poor as adults, and wealthy black boys are more likely to be poor as adults rather than stay wealthy. Oh. That's just, So, these differences in ability do not explain the patterns of intergenerational mobility. Black-white gap persists even among boys who grow up in the same neighborhood. And you can go look at those little cartoons that show redlining and all the things that we've done, to keep this systemic racism in place. It's just unbelievable. Well, I'm going to cut here for just a few things, and then I want to take questions. But unfortunately, Arkansas has a little bit of a history, don't we, of racism in the schools. I mean, we're pretty famous for, I won't even bring that up. We're pretty famous, for that. But you know what? In 1958, Cooper versus Aaron, it was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court that told Arkansas that they could not delay desegregation for the 30 months that they were going to try to delay it. So that's a landmark case. And then frankly, I think this is one of the best things that's ever happened to Arkansas. And I dealt with this. I was Jim Arnke's vice chairman of education in the Senate when we had the special session on the Lakeview case. And that was a case filed in Lakeview, Arkansas on behalf of the poor children there, mostly free and reduced lunch. And, the case, they found that Arkansas was inadequate and inequitable. And they took, which is the function of the legislature to educate children, they took that job away from us and gave it to the Supreme Court of Arkansas with the special masters until we could get it right. And I cannot tell you the hours and the hours and the hours that we spent listening to all this stuff. And inequitable has a new meaning for me. Inequitable means not even, not equal. It means giving people what they need in order to be able to achieve what they're expected to achieve. And that's certainly not equal, because that's different, for whatever people. But I'll tell you this, my personal story is I learned a lot in that session and leading up to it. And I represented then Pine Bluff and Rising and Woodlawn and Watson Chapel and all these little type areas, right? So one morning I come wheeling into my office at the Capitol, and there sits every one of my superintendents. Uh-oh. And they as much said to me, and I'll tell you, I got out of politics due to illness. The voters in my district got sick of me, and it was, and it was for what I'm getting ready to tell you right now. They told me that if I voted for school consolidation, the end. And I said, well, you know, let's be perfectly clear. I'm really clear on this. I represent you. I was elected. When I come down here, I got it, that I'm supposed to do your bidding. But I said, you know what? When I got down here and started attending all these seminars and things we had from people that were dealing with this all over the country, I said, I got so enlightened on things that, now I'm not trying to be condescending, but you may not have knowledge of, because you're looking at your district and I'm looking at the big picture. And I said, I'm just so thoroughly convinced that these children, their education is their only chance for success. And if they don't get it, I mean, it's going to be a long life. So I said, let me just respectfully say that at the end of the day, I will use my opportunity to be here to vote for the children of the state. Oh, that went over extremely well. And that's what I did. And you see, I'm no longer, there. But I'll tell you this, I did what I thought was right. I can still brush my teeth and go to sleep at night. You just have to make some of those hard decisions. That's part of it. But I think really in looking back, that was probably one of the most significant pieces of legislation that has ever been passed for this state. I really do. I mean, I just thank God that was practiced. Well, what are some things we can do? Well, we can have more peer mediation. They have youth courts around to kind of make some decisions about some of these issues. We can have more social workers involved in the school. We can have your church and others get involved in after-school programs and pay attention to what your school board is doing. Attend a school board meeting, ask about zero tolerance, ask about the resource office. There's a lot of, practical kind of things that we all can do. There are some other things I think that are kind of frightening. And one is, and I preached a sermon on this, Lynn and Annie, I didn't really realize that our bail system generates $2 billion, with a B, dollars a year for profit with insurance companies. Yeah. Could I get a $2 billion? And the bail system has now created another justice system between the wealthy and the poor. And you know what? A lot of poor people, they're there in the jail not because they did something wrong. They're there because they're poor. They couldn't pay the bail, and so they languish. And the longer that you stay there, the more likely you are to actually, go to jail. So we're not only locking up people we're mad at, we're locking up people because they're poor. Now that's pretty bad, isn't it? That's really bad. So that's one thing we can change. We're one of only 2 developed nations that have a for-profit bail system. So we can come up with some other ways that can encourage people to show up for their court date or whatever. And then, of course, we can come up with alternatives to mass incarceration. We can stop some of the mandatory minimum sentencing that goes on. Now, all of these are policy changes, but hey, I want to tell you something. We don't need term limits. You have it. It's called voting. It's called voting. You can find out how these suckers that want to go down there and represent you, that are arrogant like me, you can say, listen, sister, we've heard about you. If we're going to vote for you, you better straighten up. Yeah, you can talk to your representative, talk to them about these things. These are important things. Mental health. So many of these children, now I will give one good shout out, only one, to the Arkansas legislature this time. And that is that they passed a law that before a child can be suspended, they need to know about their family situation, what's going on at home that could have been called. That is such a big one. So I'm really applauding them. Of course, with one forward, we got one back. The SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, overturned a law about being able to sentence a juvenile to life in prison. Arkansas had made progress on that, but now we're kind of back on that one. So these are just some things we can do. We're woefully inadequate in our state in mental health treatment. And so that is something that would be so very helpful. But you know, there's one other thing that I know every person in this room can do, whether you're policy oriented or an advocate or whatever, and it's called P-R-A-Y, pray. Because guess what? Micah 6:8 does say, He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So, you know, I like to think of those people in prison. They're not those people. They're our cousins and our sons and our daughters and our relatives. You know, we've lost that. We watch cable news and we see people blowing people up over in the Middle East. We go, oh Lord, that is not news. They have been blowing each other up over there ever since, you know. No. You know, when God made the human race, I do not think that they had indelible markers then, so it could go Iran, Palestine. No, we did that. So, you know, those are our people. Those are our people. These are our people. And it says in Jeremiah, and this is, Carolyn, this is what we have on our UMW. You can go to UnitedMethodistWomen.org. You can find out everything about this you've ever dreamed of. But from Jeremiah 31:15-17, this is what the Lord says. A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted. I mean, inconsolable, because something was happening to the children. And they are no more. This is what the Lord says. Restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work will be rewarded, declares the Lord. They will return from the land of the enemy. So there is hope for your descendants, declares the Lord. Your children will return to their land. Well, just be assured, these children we're talking about today, they are captive to the enemy. Because when we have legislators and people that don't do right, that aren't moved about this, that don't make sure that people have access to health care, or they get them out of a prison when there's a pandemic, or they, you know, take care of them, that's the enemy. You know, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and, you know, powers and things like that. Well, those are powers with a lot of influence. So we can do something about that. We can do something about that. Okay, the end.